All right. Hello, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I'm so excited to have another human in healthcare with me on the podcast today. And you know what? I forgot to ask you. So I learned about you first and foremost, I think on TikTok, and on TikTok, you're Christy Gibbon, but then you're also Dr. Gibson, excuse me, Gibson. And so what would you actually prefer to be called?
I go by both.
Yeah.
When I was like getting into medical school, I was like, oh, Christine is such a more serious name. I should actually go with that because that was my birth name. But I had been Christy for 20 years at that point. So on Facebook, I was Christy, and when you link your accounts, it just transfers it over. So I was Christy on TikTok, and it's where most people know me from. So that's why the book is Christy.
I love it. Okay, well, and we are humans here, but I like to offer people the chance. So you just prefer Christy versus Dr. Gibson.
Well,
That's
Christy is kind of where I am on socials now. So yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I love it. So what I'll just say as a preamble that like I said, I discovered you, Christy, through TikTok and then realized we're in some like other social media circles. And the way you speak on TikTok about trauma and about how it's a lens that's worth looking at. So much of what the rest of society kind of judges or pathologizes has been so helpful to me and so concisely explained. And I know you even have a book coming out about that topic, which I'm like, I was saying to you, literally, I've just pre-ordered it because I need that in my life. And so that's why I thought it would be great to have you on, exploring the concept of trauma and how it could apply to even just the things personally that I am confused that I do or feel or how I react. And certainly the lens of how trauma impacts our educational system, like our medical education, and how perhaps being even just a scotch more trauma informed through our education program could be useful. I thought you'd probably have some thoughts about that. So with that as my preamble, what do you want people listening to know about you as a human in healthcare?
I think that during my 20 some year journey in medicine that I think I became less human for a while, both in terms of ignoring my human body's needs, and also just becoming so professionally boundaried that I wasn't really bringing my human self to my work. And so a lot of what I'm doing is unlearning those, procedures that we are taught through the hidden curriculum and becoming more human again.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. What was your journey in going into medicine, and what corners of this medical system have you experienced through your career?
Um, so I did medical school in Toronto, which is a very center of excellence type place. And by the time I decided I wanted to be in family medicine instead of my initial love was pediatric neurology. And I just thought, I don't know that I want to see muchly the same thing day in and day out. And I loved everything in medicine. So family medicine was really intriguing to me because I could do everything. But as soon as you put, that out there in Toronto, you just very much get pigeonholed for being an underachiever. And like I was top 10% of my class. I was a good student. So it was really weird to have this like juxtaposition of this perception of like, oh, you're aiming so low, you're just going to do family medicine. And in my mind, it was going to be the most challenging thing. So, just a lot of those hidden curriculum things starting to sneak up from a young part of my career. And because I did my residency in Calgary, I learned a lot that it meant I wasn't just referring interesting cases. And I jumped into hospitalist practice quite quickly. So I did teaching, emergency, and hospitalist within my first month of graduating. So kind of threw myself into the fire. And I don't think I understood the impact that hospitalist practice had on me physically and psychologically and spiritually until I stopped, and that was 17 years in. Um, so a lot of my medical journey, I think, imposed a considerable amount of trauma on me. And because of who I am, and like both physically and psychologically, I think it was a greater impact than it might have been on other people. So the kinds of things that I still notice is like I'm a camel. I can go without peeing for like 12, 14 hours. And when you're traveling, that's a great asset. But like, where did I learn that? I can sleep standing up, and that's to this day. And I quit
Wow.
many years ago. Like I don't get jet lag. I'm just constantly, if my body gets sleep, it grabs it. And it was because I was working like 80 to 100 hours a week, and 2 night shifts a week, and we did not sleep. And we, like, when I first started out, we would work 32, 36 hours, and that was considered normal. um Food deprivation, intermittent fasting, yeah, I just did that at work. um so there was a lot of ways that I was ignoring my very human needs in multiple scenarios related to medicine.
Mm. I actually say I wonder sometimes because so like the hidden curriculum of medicine is so far reaching in so many directions. And one area that I reflect on a lot is the lack of space for like our emotional selves, or that like we have all of these odd stories about emotions being more than physiological signals telling us about our environment. Like we have lots of other stories. And I wonder if it's like we don't even really get trained to respect more classically considered physiological needs like hunger and sleep. So now you're going to add on emotions to that. Like there's just not even the bandwidth. Or even like, are some folks in healthcare like so like deprived or even sort of cognitively impaired, if you will, like how can you sort of think about the nuance of connecting with the patient when you haven't slept in 36 hours,
And
you
the
know?
word I use is dissociated. Like, I think we
Mm.
are encouraged to dissociate, and they call it professional boundaries. But I mean, in what other job would you be a part of a code or somebody dying, and then you would just go to the next patient in the next door without processing it yourself? Like, a human just died, or you just had to tell a human awful news and they just cried for 10 minutes. Like, in what other profession do you have to completely ignore your own emotional experiences? And I think medicine encourages us to dissociate. And the more that we are in these very quick uh, and kind of intensive arrangements, the worse it is. But I mean, I can't think of a lot of jobs within medicine that you actually are encouraged to process your own emotions and feel your feelings. And yeah, I think it's a huge loss, both for us as a profession and for the patients that we work with. And it's not to say that all of us do it. I think there's a lot of us that lead with compassion and empathy, and that very human relational connection. But we're also encouraged to book 10-minute visits. And in the hospital, the parameters that they watch is like, how many patients are you seeing in an hour, and what's your time to discharge? That's not exactly conducive to relationship building. So I think a lot of that allows us to dissociate. And it's funny, I just wrote a paper for Kevin MD basically about the ability of physicians to dissociate. And someone put a comment under it saying that I was using the word wrong, but I'm not. Like, dissociation can be as mild as daydreaming, and it can be as intense as dissociative identity. And physicians really do dissociate. Like, we completely ignore all of the signals, the interoceptive signals coming from our body that needs attention. Whether that's the sensations related to emotion or our physical needs.
Oh yeah, like it's a skill, I guess. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a skill or a reflex or an ability that our nervous system has, ideally to protect us from overwhelmingly painful situations. And yet it can be sort of cultivated and conditioned by your environment and the expectations and power dynamics so that you do it at will versus in a situation where like a lion's about to eat you. Yeah, right.
I mean, our human nervous system is very primitive. Like, it's evolved to get us away from those kinds of predators. So we want to escape a predator or a natural disaster, and fight or flight would flip on for a minute or two. But now humans are living their lives in fight and flight. And physicians, we do it all day, all night sometimes. And our human physiology was not intended for that. So one of the things that made me realize I had to leave the hospital practice is I did a 24-hour blood pressure monitor during a night shift. And I could have just stroked on the job. And I knew I was unwell. Like, I knew around 2, 3 in the morning, I'd get a lot of like dizziness, nausea. But until I did the monitor, I didn't realize that my pressures were reaching 220 on 120. And that was a really strong signal to me that I was in like hyperadrenergic states and like just waves of cortisol getting me through these shifts of like physical and emotional turmoil. And that's no way to live. Like you will burn out your sympathetic nervous system. And we just happen to be really good at, using that to our advantage and burning the candle on six ends. And I recognized in about 2017 that it wasn't sustainable. I was into my 40s and I felt really exhausted. And I was starting to get a bit cynical. Like one of the things I really prided myself on was being more relational than transactional. And I just remember thinking like, oh, I can't wait to get out of here. And I thought, you're not going to practice good quality medicine when you're having those feelings. And so I moved into community at that time. And that's when I just put a lot of pieces together around trauma. I had gone through a terrible divorce and then the earthquakes in Nepal in 2015. So I'd had some personal things that were happening. My father was getting quite sick. And like the resilience that I had to just maintain that level of output was fading. And that was unanticipated because I thought, I'm an Energizer bunny. I can keep going. That blood pressure monitor was a strong signal that these things had added up and I wasn't physiologically coping. So our nervous system sends out these fight and flight and freeze mechanisms in order to protect us. But sometimes our survival strategies hurt us, whether it's hurting us physiologically, relationally, through our employment. There's lots of ways that they can show up and also cause harm. So I think recovery from trauma requires that we're self-compassionate about these responses that have developed to survive, but also to figure out how to cause less suffering to self and others.
Yeah. So I was gonna ask, how did you get out? But then it's so clear, like your body was telling you and life circumstances were inviting you. So then when you were putting those pieces together, like how how did you come to the understanding of yourself now and the impact of trauma on you and others now? Like, what was that journey like to really put those pieces together and get you to the point where you're at now?
Well, I think a lot of it was just CME, to be honest. I graduated in 1999 in Toronto, and that is the same year that the ACEs study came out. So I'd heard of the ACEs study or adverse childhood experiences, but I did not understand the impact of ACEs on individuals until I hit community practice. And I was working in a very low income, high ACE score community health center. Not that they were measuring, but the thing that really struck me was the consistent story that I was hearing from the practice population that I had was tremendous amounts of developmental trauma. And I was recognizing through understanding the ACE study and epigenetics that, you know, their incredible amount of mental and physical health illnesses were directly related to those traumas. And I had no skills in my toolkit to deal with that. So I kept thinking, like, I'm putting out the same fire. It's exhausting me. They're going to die young. What do I actually do to tend the roots of this problem? And so I started doing a deep dive into what would it look like to actually know how to manage trauma. So in 2017, when I entered community practice is when I started doing a really deep dive, and it really quickly became my part-time job. I got certified in a dozen different trauma modalities. I studied with all of the famous people around trauma, from Gabor Mate to Bessel van der Kolk, and I would fly anywhere in the world to learn a skill set. Because at that point in my career, I had the privilege to do that. I was, 20 years out, and I thought, well, I can retrain in something important. And I mean, I can often cure PTSD, which as a family doctor, I didn't think was possible, but it is. And it's in a really powerful skill set because it's underlying so much of what we're seeing. And I mean, I'm talking about developmental trauma and high ACE scores, but I mean, physicians have it, dentists have it, lawyers have it, nurses certainly have it. There are so many people that are dealing with trauma on a daily basis. Just think about a realtor. They're dealing with marriage, divorce, and death. But do they think that they're dealing with trauma? No, they don't consider it that way. People are showing up in their fight and flight response. So they're aggressive and irritable at the checkout counter. They're with their families. They're showing up in freeze, which often means they're not showing up, but they're stuck in bed. They're stuck on their couch watching Netflix. Like, our trauma responses are showing up in day-to-day life. And I think the pandemic kind of unmasked that collectively. So we now actually have the vocabulary and the interest to figure out, well, what is my intersection with trauma and how is it affecting me and the people that I love?
Mm, that's so powerful. And I also just love how you followed what was giving you answers and followed it all the way. I relate to that. So I just think that's amazing that you did that, because a lot of people are like, well, I'm just trapped in this medicine thing forever. And you've made changes that were congruent to your values and who you wanted to be. So I just wanted to like name that bit of it. Um, and then I'm curious. So you're saying that you're now in a position where, so what is your role now? Are you still at the community health center, or like how is it that you work with folks around trauma at this point?
I did close my family practice during the pandemic. I'm one of the people that did not survive the impact on family medicine. So I work at the refugee clinic, so obviously very highly traumatized population, and I work in adult addiction. So what I've tried to find is clinical environments where patients can't access trauma therapy. Like, free therapy is generally CBT. CBT, in my opinion, does not treat trauma. So I learned all these other modalities. Many of them are body-based, trauma processing skills like accelerated resolution therapy, matrix reimprinting. People can't afford $200, $250 an hour therapists to do that. So I tried to find clinical environments where there was a lot of trauma and the impact of having a free practitioner to manage it would be high. So I still see a handful of my family practice patients just for mental health shared care. I took very few consults because I'm trying to just work clinically 3 days a week. Like I mentioned, I'm doing a doctorate. I just wrote my first book. I have hopefully 2 more in the pipeline. I'm doing a lot more speaking engagements and obviously daily TikToks. That's what I'm become a bit renowned for. And my hope is to launch some entrepreneurial practice around trauma-informed care. So like I mentioned, all of these professions that are dealing with trauma without having the insight and skill set to manage it. We're founding a company called Safer Spaces Training that will allow us to train professional bodies and organizations to have trauma-informed spaces, skills like psychological first aid, trauma-informed communication, trauma-informed DEI. That's what we're focusing on, is trying to get this leverage, not just the one-on-one work that I've been doing. The other thing that I've studied since 2017 is social innovation and design thinking. So I did a residency at the Banff Center. I've got a certificate in it. And that really tells me that I need to leverage the power that I have with all these letters behind my name to work in systems and not just that one-on-one level. So my intention is to find the systems that are amenable to talking about this.
Mm. Oh, that's so, because like, yeah, there's the version of this which would still be incredible where you worked at those clinics and you did this work and you impacted those lives. And that would be beautiful. Like, there's not like what's enough, but also the notion that you're interested in spreading that impact through training and social media. Did you have trepidations about that? Like that's a bit of a pivot from what classic, like what U of T you might have thought you'd do with your career, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I still have second guessing myself all the time. Like, how did you end up being a TikTok doctor? But I mean, for one thing, I love the space. I know you're there as well. I find TikTok is one of the places that I learn the
Mhm.
most because the people with lived experience and doing incredible advocacy work are on TikTok. Like, it's not just dancers there. And I think that's why they want to shut the platform down, is because it's where we organize and it's where we gain all this insight. So I've learned a ton on the platform, but I have a young person in my life. Her name is Ashwarya, and she said, the way that you break down mental health concepts, it's so accessible. And people my age in their 20s are really needing this information. Could you please join TikTok? So it was her idea. And I said, well, I don't even know what this is. Like, where do I download it? What does this mean? And she just said, just watch YouTube videos and figure out how to do it. And I did. I just watched YouTube tutorials for about 2 weeks to figure out how to make it work. And I had a couple of viral videos in my first month, like reached about 50,000 views. And then about 6 months in, I had a video that reached 1 million views. And the platform just took off from there. So people were wanting this information. It's not that I get viral every day, but I do believe that I post pretty good content every day. So I'm trying to give people valuable information, whether it's this is how you shift your nervous system response, or these are the things causing trauma at the community level. And here are some solutions to consider. So I infuse design thinking. I infuse all kinds of things into my work on TikTok. Like, I'm not going to talk about trauma without talking about racism, or talking about transphobia, or talking about COVID response, or climate change. I mean, these are so intricately interconnected. And I think when people try to find that niche, they don't allow themselves to look at the systems level. And I think that's one thing that I love about the platform is I can link all of those things and help people understand that these are transdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary problems, which is what my doctorate is in, is transdisciplinary studies. That's really what I think of myself as. I like, I'm a doctor, yeah, but I am also other things, and I have other interests. And medicine's so quick to put you in that box and say, this is what your career looks like, and this is what you look like. And I don't know that I ever really fit the box. I mean, I studied Ayurvedic counseling and Qigong teaching like years before I even started doing this stuff. I have a master's in medical education. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is knowledge translation. And knowledge translation can be publications, and I still try to put some of those out every once in a while. But to me, TikTok is KT, and it's really effective KT. There is no other place where I could publish a paper. Well, I mean, it would have to be a pretty exceptional paper and have 100,000 or 1 million views on it. And I can get that on TikTok. So like, it's a beautiful place to have creative knowledge translation. And I love the creativity aspect. I mean, today I posted a video of me doing pottery in my basement. And I talked about how, the story that we tell ourselves about what we hope for in our lives can change, just like pottery doesn't always turn out the way you expect it to look like once it gets on the wheel. So, yeah, I love the creative aspect of it. So TikTok to me has been a tremendous experience. And I really hope that the platform survives all of this targeted assault, because it is not a privacy issue. Like, Facebook and Google already had all these pieces of information on us. It's makes me curious about why they're targeting it.
Yeah, like which one's a bit more controllable potentially, might not very inform me, right? It's like interesting. I saw on TikTok, well, actually, what I was going to say from what you just said, like the thing that is really interesting. So say the traditional ways of getting knowledge out is this top down through ivory towers of journals, like who reads journals versus who watches a TikTok, right? And I guess there's benefit to both, because people with more power maybe read journals and they need to learn some things, but then also the folks where it's like really impacting them, like having this sort of, like you say, not just anti-disciplinary, but like just across society, it's such a leveler that way, which I just think is so wonderful. And one thing I've heard you speak about is your views about how trauma can explain things that sort of, certainly some of the traditional ways I was trained around how to diagnose a mental health condition and what the options are for treating it. Like when you say like CBT, when they kind of, I just feel like when you learn about it in school and it's sort of like, well, here are all the medications and here's like all the differences between them. And here's all the studies that show that they're kind of all the same, which doesn't mean they're bad, but it's like lots of details and a lot of like, I am a teacher, a professor for medical learners as well. And it's sort of already in them. They're like, well, I just need to make sure I really know the meds. And I'm not like, yeah, let's know the meds. And then it's like, oh yeah, and then therapy, like CBT or something, right? Like it's always sort of CBT is the one that's like gets out there. And I just think that's so tricky. Like what I feel like what I kind of gleaned, not explicitly, but the vibe I got about the word trauma and, when trauma came up in my training was mostly specifically around sexual trauma and in the context of like being thoughtful around a pelvic exam, which is that's good. But like also like don't talk about it. Like if you talk about it in the room with the patient, then it's going to open Pandora's box because trauma is very bad and very scary. And so I feel like honestly, that's kind of as far as traditional training got me. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about that and what you wish that all medical learners were being trained around trauma and how it probably would make our lives and careers a lot easier if we had a deep understanding of trauma. That's my leading question.
And I have that same feeling about Pandora's box. Like once you've unearthed a story, I mean, can you contain the story? Are you going to get vicarious trauma from the story? And then like once it's in the room, if you can't offer support around it, then you feel pretty helpless. And one of the major traumas of being a doctor is when we do feel powerless because we're told we're supposed to fix things. And when we find something that we don't have the skills for, then we feel really useless and powerless, and it kind of activates our own moral distress around the job and being fixers or healers. So I mean, the Pandora's box concept is inherently flawed because the patients are living inside the box. So you
Oh,
can't open the
yeah.
box and say, oh, look at that. Oh my gosh, like I didn't know that was in there. They're inside. They're dealing with that on the daily. So I don't think that unearthing the trauma story itself can be detrimental, but I do think that hope is key. So the secondary title of my book has to do with nurturing a path towards post-traumatic growth. And I think that's essential. If you say, oh my gosh, you've been traumatized, well, according to the ACEs study, that's going to take 10 years off your life. I mean,
No.
that's not going to hope or help their immune system stay in power, because as soon as they get into fight and flight because you've told them that, their immune system shuts off because it was parasympathetic. So part of the key is co-regulation. So maintaining that really nurturing relationship, letting them know that you're with them in the journey. I personally think that physicians can learn skills for at least the first stage of trauma recovery. So the first stage is just establishing safety. How can they learn to keep their nervous system more safe? I mean, it could be something as simple as breath work. CBT can work for that stage. I do a lot of body-based practices. So I teach folks havening, tapping, which is self-acupressure. I teach them how to tremor their body the way a dog or a horse would. Humans are perfectly capable of tremoring as well. It's from the psoas muscle. It's called TRE. So I've learned this really neat skill set where I can teach people how to regulate their own nervous systems. And I honestly think every physician should have it. So I put how to do each of those things as a chapter in my book. And then I have a video attached to the QR code. So when Catherine Smart, the recent CMA president, read my book as one of the early endorsers, she emailed me and said, every single medical student should have this as a textbook. And we should be encouraging physicians to have these skills and to have this understanding. And then the second stage of trauma recovery is processing. It's actually not that hard. So when I say that I can cure PTSD symptoms, I mean, the most effective tool that I have is accelerated resolution therapy. I learned that on a 3-day weekend. Could more of us do that? Absolutely. We have to take the time in our practice. Like it's a solid 90-minute session to do one of those therapy sessions, but it's not like I'm doing that every week with a person. We spend so much more time on stage 1 and then the stage 3 recovery. So processing is 1 or 2 appointments. But I think more of us could have that skill set. I think it's well within the scope of family medicine. And then the third stage is like, well, who am I in the world without all of these trauma symptoms and survival strategies being predominant? And then I use something called NARM, or the neuroaffective relational model. I use internal family systems or parts work and try to say, well, who are you? What is it that you are underneath those strategies? So I mean, because I'm certified in so many different modalities, I have this incredible toolbox. But could every family doctor get two of those tools? Absolutely. You can learn those in my book. And that was my intention, is to say, DIY guys, like, you don't actually have to spend, 6, 7 years like I did. You can learn these things quite quickly and have less helplessness when you encounter trauma, not just in your patients, but in yourselves. I mean, it's one of the reasons why physicians have such high rates of substance use ourselves and such high suicide rates, is because we don't actually have our own ways of regulating our nervous system. So I think we need that to be able to be good co-regulators with our patients. But we also need it personally. And the more skills that we can develop around this, and I'm not slamming CBT and saying that it's never helpful, but I think it's more helpful in the context of lifestyle maneuvers. Like, if you're trying to talk to a person about why they're not managing their diabetes, CBT is a great skill. It can also be really helpful in self-management of things like anxiety and depression symptoms. So there's a book called Mind Over Mood, and a book like that, like a workbook that is predicated on CBT, has equal outcomes to therapy. But there's a lot that needs to be addressed at the body level. And I think we've been ignoring that for a long time. And it's one of the things that the patients are recognizing. And like, I had a patient come to me to talk about polyvagal theory. I had a patient tell me about Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. People are starting to understand that trauma is held in our nervous systems, and they're demanding that we help them with it. And I had no skills until I took a really deep dive. But I think this thing should be in our curriculum, and I'm hoping that as more medical schools are noticing we need trauma-informed spaces, we also need trauma-skilled practitioners, that they will encourage us to have this skill set as well. Because, I mean, the way mental health is in Canada, it's not included in the universal health system. And if they do have access to something free, it's almost always CBT. And sure, that might help with insomnia, generalized anxiety. There might be a certain number of things that could help with, but I found personally that when I had anybody with trauma and I sent them to a free resource, it often didn't help, and it sometimes triggered.
Mm-hmm. You need to be at least understood the context of it, even if you're not addressing it directly, right? Like, that's the thing. It's so fascinating that we, as the humans who are caring for the other humans' bodies, are actively conditioned and trained and encouraged to dissociate from our bodies, like we said at the beginning. And that is traumatizing and not good, just for ourselves personally, but also like the deep well of knowledge. And I really have this thought, maybe because you know the studies, like, I think clinical reasoning and our ability to really like understand what's happening in our patient's body, it has gotten a lot easier for me. Well, first of all, to not think I need to know the diagnosis, but like at least like have a sense of what might be going on as I've become more connected with my body. There's something happening, like it's brain to brain, but there's something also happening body to body in those rooms when you're more grounded yourself, where especially if you're not thinking, I've got to know all the answers, I've got to be the expert, I've got to dominate this person in the room, which is like kind of what we are told a professional is supposed to be. I think it really makes everyone's jobs easier. And so anyway, I guess the people who founded the medical schools, the white gentlemen who did that, were not so connected with their bodies. But it's like, I don't know. Do you have this vision? I have this vision of what medicine and healthcare really could be if we were way more integrated with, like, this isn't like woo, this is like literally our nervous systems. It's literally science, And like, what do you think would be possible in healthcare if we were really designing healthcare around the fact that it's populated by humans? You know what I mean? What is your thought about that?
I share your dream.
Cool.
Yeah, I really share your dream. And I think we cause a lot of medical trauma, and then that causes us vicarious trauma because we're causing the trauma. And then the whole thing just gets really circular because we feel so much shame, and it activates those parts of us that already felt shame, because we all have that because we're human. And then it just gets circular. We try to overcompensate, and then we show up in fight, flight, and freeze, and we continue to harm. So we perpetuate medical trauma with the existing status quo, and it hurts us just as much as it hurts patients and communities. Yeah, and I just want to also note that the people who get harmed the most are the ones who are at the highest risk, right? Like the reason I did my master's in medical education is because I created our R3, like our fellowship year in health equity. We called it global health back in those days. But it was really like, who are the people that are underserved? And it is the people that are the most heavily traumatized that are underserved. And I think a lot of it is because we don't have the skill set, and we don't feel like we can handle our own nervous system around that much trauma. And we can't. It is really, really hard. So because of where I had worked for my first 20 years, I had a greater ability to manage my own nervous system responses when I was facing physical, social trauma. But so because it's about mirror neurons, right? So like what you're talking about is really the essence of co-regulation. Like when your nervous system can stay in what polyvagal theory calls ventral vagal, but it's basically the calm social engagement of our parasympathetic nervous system. But most doctors are operating in sympathetic, and patients know it. I mean, you can tell when a person is with you in sympathetic or parasympathetic. It's like there's an energy that's being emitted from that aspect of them. And when we can show up in that calm and engaged demeanor, it really changes the interaction. It changes the patient's experience of how we show up, and it changes our sense of being human in the interaction. So I think it's a part of what's going to heal the profession, but it's not how we're currently taught to show up. And I think if we paid more attention to, like, instead of just teaching, well, on the history, you ask about exacerbating and alleviating factors, and you ask these things in the social history, and then you check in with your nervous system and you take a couple of nice long exhales, and that's when you're signposting, and you give them a chance to do an open-ended response. And as you're really doing active listening, how are you checking in with your own nervous system, and what does that feel like, and how do you notice your interoceptive, which is like, what are the signals you're getting from your body, often interpreted as emotions, and what are there's also neuroception, is what's the signals that you're getting when there's danger or threat. And I mean, in the hospital-based practice, I was taught to totally suppress my feeling of threat and danger because it was my pager. So like when my pager would go off, it would often be like a code blue or a code 66, and I had to just kind of push those really scary feelings down and manage whatever was happening. So like, what does it actually feel like to pay attention to signals of danger or threat? Like, could we be doctors that could actually sniff out cancer the way some dogs can do it? Like, I honestly think if we were more in tune with our bodies, the level of care that we would give would completely change. Limitless possibilities in my mind.
I really think that's so interesting. And I would love to explore. I really love like thinking of clinical skills, like fully trauma informed clinical skills, and just including your human experience of clinically assessing someone. And that's a bit of what we offer to our learners, of not just here is what you do, but like, and how are you feeling through that? And here are the skills of managing the fact that you're a human talking to another. Like, I'm immediately obsessed with how we should definitely do that. I love that. I have a medical student now. I'm like, how can I just chat with her? That sounds so good. Oh my gosh.
And in family medicine, we learn how to fife in an interview, like, so addressing feelings, ideas, fears, and expectations. But what are ours? Like, what are our feelings, ideas, fears, and expectations about that very same encounter? We have that same thing, and we never talk about it. So there were these like historical Bellant groups where we would talk about our feelings about medicine, and I really think we need to resurrect those. I think the reason why these Facebook groups exist and why people have the daily vent and they want to talk about their feelings more is because we haven't opened up enough safe spaces for us to be human in those ways.
Yep, I agree. Obviously, that's like what I'm trying to do here and what you're trying to do over there. So I'm biased, but I also I do think it's the answer. It just always made me feel a little almost like, why are we not talking about this? Why do we, and it's like the secret that we literally are all carrying. And especially now, I do these coaching one-on-one with mostly physicians and some other clinicians, and they're all like, think they have this deep secret, and then it's the same thing that everyone else feels inside, because it's what you feel when you're a human like going through this, and it's all the hidden curriculum, it's all actually the same. And but when it's silenced, then like we think it's us and we're the imposter, and we have to hide those parts of ourselves, and it's just incredible. It's like double damaging then, because we can't even talk about our wounded parts.
Well, and we feel such deep-seated shame about it.
Yeah.
I would feel shame when I couldn't physically manage, the job, or I would feel um shame when I couldn't cure something like what you were saying. And I think Rachel Naomi Remen, she was one of my teachers through Lissa Rankin's course, and she has the most beautiful saying around the difference between curing and healing. And I think even when cure isn't possible, healing absolutely is. So one part of my practice that I really cherish is doing medical assisted death. And part of it is that I think of it as a really healing aspect of care. And I approach this with such humanity. And if the family member is crying as the person dies, generally so do I.
Yeah.
I talk to them about, the existential pain of death. And and the fact that palliative care often does its best, but can't alleviate some of these bigger symptoms. And I think if I didn't have a greater awareness of my own experience in healthcare, I don't think I could be doing MAID at this point, because the people who kind of dissociate and power through, they're not really seeing the human on the other end of that consultation. And that to me brings so much meaning and peace and connection.
Mm.
Um, I've had so many patients say to me during a MAID consult, like, this was one of the best consultations I've ever had with a doctor. And I'm thinking,
Oh,
it's so weird because of what we're talking about, but also like this can be really healing and beautiful. And that's my intention, is to try to make it that as much as possible. I tell most of my patients that I love them. I know we're not supposed to do it, but I think it really matters.
mm.
I mean, I don't, if there's any question around boundaries or, if I think that a person's going to take it the wrong way, but most of them don't. They really need me to love them.
Oh, that's so powerful. Oh my gosh. I'm curious, as we're wrapping up, this is such a 360 or a different planet in some ways. In some ways there's overlap, but like this is just a really radical, in the good way, transformational approach to what we do with patients. And it can feel maybe like a lot, especially if some listening are like, I can't do all of that. I'm supposed to stay on time and not get sued, and like, all the things that we get sort of paralyzed by. So what would you say are some like starting steps that if someone just feels totally burnt out, if they're like listening, they're like, I am so dissociated, I don't even know how I would begin to associate with myself. What would you suggest they try to begin?
Well, and honestly, this is why I wrote the book. So not to plug it too hard, but um it's personal. So like I could suggest a couple of skills, but it might not be the right skills for your listeners. So
Yeah.
there are so many different ways to come out of dissociation. There are so many different ways to come out of fight and flight. And the key is learning your own nervous system. So Deb Dana has a program on Sounds True, and she calls it befriending your nervous system. And that's exactly it. So learning your own nervous system responses and what works to shift you out of the responses where you feel stuck. There are countless tools. So I use some cognitive tools like affirmations, where you take an affirmation and add a what if on the front. That was my first very
Ooh.
viral TikTok. It's such a brilliant skill. It's one of my favorites because it very overtly opens up pathways of possibility. And trauma responses are just locked in responses, and they're almost like a reflex. And the opposite of trauma isn't joy all the time. The opposite of trauma is flexibility. And so what if questions are offering up those pathways towards possibility. So if you're burned out and your brain is like, oh my God, it's going to be another bad day, and you try to gaslight yourself into saying, it's going to be a great day, I can totally handle it. The what if would look like, what if it could be a good day today? What if I can actually handle today? And you're just planting those seeds. So what ifs are one of the skills that I really love. Affirmations is what I call them. And then body-based practices. So for some people, it's breath work or yoga. But there are so many things that I was completely unaware of until I really dove deep into the trauma practitioner world. And the things that clinicians are using are definitely slanting towards the somatic. So top down is those cognitive tools, bottom up is those body-based tools. And there are a tremendous number of them out there. So I mentioned a few like havening, tapping, tremoring. There are so many different ways that we can enliven our body to process the trauma that we go through. So I do tremoring every time I'm stressed out. And I often do it if I can't sleep. I just let my body shake as if I'm a puppy dog and I'm trying to let go of the stress of my day. And I think it's releasing my sympathetic tone. Some people can do that through dance. Some people can do that through martial arts, but they're like ways that we need to release the tension in our somatic, sympathetic, tense tone.
Yeah.
I think that's really key. So learning your own nervous system and learning what shifts most effectively for you, and that might also change over the lifetime. It doesn't take a lot of time. One of the things I love about my practice is I do it all day with my patients. So if I'm doing havening touch and I'm really gently, patting myself on the hand and the shoulder, I can finish my day feeling super chill, even though I've been doing trauma therapy all day. And I never would have guessed that to be true. But because I'm doing all of these practices as a mirror, I feel really calm myself at the end of most days.
Oh, I love knowing that to be true. And I mean, if nothing else, isn't that a selling point to try it out? That's like a lot of how I frame like the things that I'm exploring and sharing are like, look at how they will help you feel better. Because I certainly things that really genuinely help us feel feel more, feel better, and understand that we can discover safety in our own bodies. Like that will have a major impact on how we provide patient care, and that's important. But like just even centering that it can be centered for our own wellness first, and we can spend time tending to ourselves first, and that will just vicariously help our work in healthcare. I just love the notion of like, yes, I'm definitely gonna look at the video for havening. That sounds amazing. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and it's so simple. Like these things that I'm teaching in the book and that I teach on TikTok, they're so simple and they're so intuitive. Like our body actually already intuitively knows how to do these. And I'll encounter some patients who'll say, "Oh yeah, I already do that thing." Like this is a really powerful tapping point in acupressure. And patients will say to me, "Oh yeah, I'm really drawn to this area of my body, and I just rub right here on my upper chest whenever I'm stressed out in the clavicle region." And I'll think, wow, your body really knows what to do. And I'll encounter that already. So I do think that once you start having these practices, you'll recognize that your body was already attuned to them in some way. And sadly, medical practice kind of tunes us out of a lot of that. So how do we tune back in? Like to me, it was kind of like a radio station where I was just listening to the go, go, go hamster wheel. And I was like, okay, like I need new stations. I need to be able to do other things too. And could I still do hospital-based practice? Yeah, but I also think that I would approach it in a totally different way now. So much more awareness of my own needs. And even if it's going to keep me an hour late if I take a lunch break, I'm going to take that lunch break and I'm going to listen to some music that I love, and I'm going to do some havening in the doctor's room, and then I'm going to show up in the afternoon feeling really regulated again. So I think it is possible to manage it even in a really high stress environment. But I also think more and more of us are leaving those. And I worry about the systems because they didn't allow us to look after ourselves and we weren't really taught how to do that well. And the systems are going to suffer tremendously as we all, flee these harmful environments where we don't feel safe. And frankly, we're not.
Yeah. I mean, that's the critical piece, is really acknowledging that we're not, you
Yeah.
know, like that this work done in this way in the system as it's built now is harmful to the humans that it's employing. Like it's a problem. So I have hope that especially if enough people, enough places awaken to it, then that can start to create the changes. It needs to have major innovation. Otherwise, I'm not sure, you know?
I really think we need new leadership structures, like the
Mm.
old leadership styles who don't understand these things around epigenetics and ACEs and nervous system responses. They need to be replaced by people who do. And I think
Yeah.
that's the only thing that will make change. So we can put a band-aid and like have a trauma-informed seminar in the middle of your regular scheduled program, and it's not going to make a difference. So we need major shifts. And so for people who are, you know, in leadership and wanting to make it better for all people involved and do real systems change, I think this is going to be central.
Mm-hmm. And break all the rules that are holding you back, because all those rules are part of the problem. That's another thing I really think. It's like, just, we haven't figured it out yet. Don't worry about the rules. Like, clearly a bunch of them will need to be rewritten if we're actually going to do this, because they weren't written correctly to begin with, you know?
Well, and you were commenting earlier about my TikTok about the DSM and the recent study showing the lack of
Yeah.
sensitivity and the lack of reproducibility, and that was like legitimate, amazing research with beautiful pictographs. But like part of, like I was saying it tongue in cheek, well, what do we do? Burn the book? But I kind of mean it. Like, what would it look like to burn the book and just start from scratch with the DSM? Because, you know, the construct was 1920s when they were trying to track down, you know, the words that they used. It's in my book. I can't think of it right now, but it's horrifyingly tragic the way that we described people who had psychiatric conditions back then. And like when the foundations are harmful and so oppressive, and you continue to build on that foundation, you are bound to do ongoing harm. So I
Mm.
really think that with a lot of these paradigms that we feel like we're married to, what would it look like if we weren't? I'm just curious about that. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to start some new medical schools. I've seen um, James McCoy talk about it on Twitter in the context of like decolonizing methodologies in medical systems, which I think is also of critical importance and very linked to the trauma in our systems. And I was like, man, I would be on your faculty in a heartbeat.
Yes. Okay. We have all the same dreams. And I love that. I think that's a wonderful information to end with. Like, what if we totally reinvented the healthcare system? Or, what if healthcare actually centered all the humans that deliver and receive care? That sounds like a good what if to end on. So
I
with
love that
that,
so yes.
I please plug your book. I think it's great. And just let everyone know how else they could be following and learning from you.
Sure. Yeah. On TikTok, if I've convinced you to join, is TikTok Trauma Doc. My book is called The Modern Trauma Toolkit. And so moderntrauma.com is an easy pathway to find the links to purchase, but you know, it's available in every single bookstore. So I really obviously encourage your smaller local booksellers. And my professional website, where I do lots of keynote talks and talk about systems change, is christinegibson.net. And Safer Spaces Training is the new company that we are launching to help people create safer spaces organizationally and professionally. So my hope is that someday this would be standard practice. Like when you do your CME credits, you also have to be certified in knowing safer spaces and being a trauma-informed human. So that's my goal, is to make it like regulatory standard of practice to have this information, because the older generations aren't going to get it unless we mandate it. And there's a lot of people in medicine who are still teaching the younger generations, and we will continue to miss this really important information until we get it embedded into systems.
Mm. Well, and I will put all of those links in the show notes as well. So if people are listening or watching, then they'll be able to find you all those places. Thank you so much. I
Oh,
enjoy you and I know this was all basically just like, yes, agree, but those are my favorite. I am so grateful to know that there are other humans in this system who are dreaming and not just dreaming, but like creating the healthcare system of our imaginations. This is how we do it. So thank you so much for what you do.
oh, thank you too. I'm really excited that you're getting the word out about the change makers in healthcare.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll see you all next week.